Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for coming. This is part 2 of a series of conversations that we're having with Professor Bialystok, which we can help me and welcome Bialystok. This is a privilege. Ellen is a pioneer in bilingualism, and a lot of her research on the brain, on cognition, has led to a definite shift in the field of bilingualism, bilingual education, how we understand how the brain functions. And maybe as a warm-up question, and could you guide us through the path that you followed throughout your career and your research, and what led you to this field and to New York this morning?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for coming out on a very uninviting day. It must have been an effort to even get out of bed. I was trained as a developmental psychologist. My interest was in language and cognitive development. I wanted to understand how children learn words, how they learn what those words meant, and how they put it all together into a developing cognitive system. So that's what I did on my graduate work. But after I graduated, for reasons that are, accidents of where you happen to end up or get a job, or reasons you didn't really predict, I found myself in a situation studying second language acquisition. By children in high school who were taking French courses, by adults. At the time, this was the late 1970s, this was not a topic of study for psychology or for developmental psychology. It was a topic of study for applied linguistics, second language acquisition. So these were very different fields. So I was actually very fortunate because I was the first person who came to look at this field, second language acquisition, through the lens of psychology. And it was interesting. And it was really open territory because it allowed me to ask questions that had not been asked before. So that became a deep thread in my subsequent work. And for the next 15 years at least, maybe 20 years, my main research was in children becoming bilingual because these threads became intertwined for me. And I noticed that as bilingual children were developing this set of ordinary ideas and concepts that all children need to develop in order to learn to read. These are meta-linguistic concepts, understanding what print is, what sounds of the word mean, how writing represents sounds, but that very special and yet deeply abstract symbolic relationship is. I realized that these essential insights were coming to bilingual children more readily than they were to monolingual children. Something about these basic ideas were clearer to bilingual children. That's important because these ideas are the basis for literacy. Extending that work, we soon moved into another area of the development of what's called executive function or executive control processes. These are the things that your mind does, quite without you being aware of it, to keep you focused on the important information, especially when there's distractions. So my favorite example of why we need an executive function system is driving on a freeway. You know very well what you need to be looking at, but there are a million things competing for your attention. So you really need to focus with an effortful will. Don't read the signs on don't answer the text, don't change the radio station, don't stop the kids fighting in the back seat. These are all dangerous distractions, and it's this executive function system that allows you to do the task. So these are very important processes, and we discovered bilingual children are achieving them a little earlier, 6 months to a year earlier at every developmental stage. So that completed the work with children. I started in around 2000. I began studying adults, and we were able to extend this research quite dramatically by including brain imaging, older adults, and patients. The bottom line is that we now have a body of work that's very coherent in that it shows across the entire lifespan from the moment of birth until late into older age, even when there is neurodegenerative disease and dementia. Bilingualism affects all aspects of cognitive function.
So there are many educators in the room. Some are teachers, some are school principals with bilingual programs, and in New York City in particular, there's a widespread view, at least in my opinion, it's growing, that the benefits of bilingualism are real, that they extend beyond the realm of languages, that there are fairly useful skills to have, in particular, if you want to perform well in school, if you want to succeed later in life, but that's, knowing two languages offer advantages in learning, for instance, how to read or how to write or even how to do mathematics, for instance.
Right. So I want to put that in a slightly different way. That's absolutely right. There are documented areas of academic achievement and cognitive development that can be considered to benefit from bilingualism. There are other areas of academic achievement and cognitive development for which there is no effect of bilingualism. There may be some trivial areas for healthy, typically developing children where bilingualism could be a problem, and let me just get this straight out there. Are there no places where bilinguals do worse? Yes, there is. On average, which doesn't mean every single bilingual, bilinguals have a smaller vocabulary in each language than monolingual speakers of that language, and they take milliseconds. You know what a millisecond is? It's a thousandth of a second. They'll take maybe 50 milliseconds longer to retrieve a word. Those are the disadvantages. But above all of this, bilinguals can speak two languages. And that has nothing to do with cognitive or academic outcomes. So if we want to train our children for the world, I think giving them languages is a responsibility because it enables communication across cultures, travel, understanding, and so on. So exactly, there are some actual cognitive benefits. There are no serious cognitive deficits, but we have to remember that this is all in the context of giving children the ability to speak another language, which is never mentioned in this research, I'm sorry to say.
All right, so my daughters go to a very good school in Greenpoint, PS110, which has a French dual language program. And there are many dual language programs in New York City. The chancellor has now even announced the creation of 48 new programs in Italian, German, Russian, Urdu, Bengali, Russian. How early should children join these programs? And what as a city-wide policy, what would you recommend that we do here?
First, there's no correct answer. There isn't an age where you really need to start. And the corollary of that means there isn't an expiry date either. So it's not that there's a window that you've got to meet and then opportunity is closed. This is a lifelong possibility. So why start earlier rather than later? There's a few reasons. One is I think it's just easier for kids to pick up another language when they're younger, not because their brains are better at language learning per se, but think about what a very young child needs to know to get by in a language. It's actually not very much. You know, they need to know some playground vocabulary, they need to name the things around them, they need to interact in simple dialogues with people. It's really not very much. Now, an adult learning a second language has to be able to go to the bank and negotiate a mortgage and, you know, all that sort of stuff. This is a completely different learning task. So when we talk about the difference in second language learning ability between children and adults, we're not talking about the same problem. We're talking about learning different things. So because young children don't have that much to learn, it's pretty easy to do it. Another reason I think starting earlier is a good idea for kids is if you have, this may be an unfair statement, but based on my experience in public education in Canada, if you have a child who's, you know, pretty intelligent, normal, typically developing kid, the regular public school curriculum is not all that challenging. They can do it, right? And if they worked a little harder or needed to do a little extra work, they could probably do it even better. So in that sense, it's kind of an add-on to a curriculum that's not typically pushing them very hard. So those are a couple of reasons to start earlier. But that doesn't rule out also starting later. So, you know, introducing language to children is always a good idea, and you do it when opportunities allow.
So even if we miss the entry point, there's always hope. And gain from the benefits of becoming bilingual, even if it's later in life.
Yes, because these benefits that I'm talking about, these changes that we find in the brain, are tied to how long you've been bilingual, not to what age you were when you started becoming bilingual. Now, they are related because the earlier, obviously this is arithmetic, the younger you are when you add on another language, then throughout your life, you always have more years. But, you know, if you could kind of separate those, it's hard to do, but if you separate them, what's really important is how much of your life you've spent as a bilingual.
So, is it true that my daughters will be maths champions when they finish with the S1 term?
I'm sure they will, Fabrice, but not because of French.
Oh, okay. So, what other advantages could we talk about in that case? And again, last night we spoke a little bit about the myth, but it's also important for school and educators to be clear about the expectations and there are parents as well in the room. So what is to be expected from a bilingual education program in terms of advantages and results?
Right. So I would not put any academic subjects on the list of potential benefits. There are a couple of studies that show they might be better in math, but I'm not convinced those studies have enough controls in them to make that a conclusion. Learning to read, if you're learning to read in two languages that are written in the same writing system and the same script, there's a crossover benefit, it comes easier. But if your two languages are written in different writing systems, there's no spillover benefit. So it depends. The real benefit for children's cognition is in the development of what I referred to earlier as the executive function system. So the executive function system is the most important thing children develop. It predicts all outcomes. It predicts academic success, long-term health and well-being. It predicts relationship stability. Kids who develop really strong executive functions. You may have heard of the marshmallow test.
What is the
Marshmallow test is a very famous study, actually from New York. About 40 years ago, kids were brought into the lab, 4-year-old kids were brought into the lab, and sat down, and a marshmallow, which is a huge treat, okay, you gotta think like a 4-year-old, is put in front of
I
them.
know what you mean. Marshmallows in cartoons, yes?
Oh yeah. And then the kid is told, there you go, that's your marshmallow. You can eat it now if you like. But if you wait 10 minutes, I'll give you 2. And then the experimenter leaves the room. And the cameras are running. And it's really hilarious because they sit on there. Oh. And so this was all documented. And so there's some kids who manage to wait and get 2 marshmallows, and there's a whole pile of kids who don't. They just eat the marshmallow. So that was 40 years ago. And about every 10 years since then, these same kids have been brought back. And the ones who did not eat the marshmallow have done better in life. This is true. So what allows you to not eat the marshmallow is the executive control that monitors your behavior, your impulses, gives you the strength to inhibit that immediate desire to attend to something else. That is executive control.
I'll try this at home this evening. Wow. So, now, there are many factors that could influence bilingualism, bilingual education, of course, from the socioeconomic status, cultural backgrounds. All of this is often mixed up in the outcome of bilingual education. But so how can schools help children become bilingual in this regard?
Right, and so what I'd like to do is address the premise of the question first. And the premise of the question is really important. It's that these skills I'm talking about, executive function skills that are really so important in development, are also influenced by other things. Socioeconomic status, huge. And another one that I'm going to talk about for a minute is the child's level of attentional control. So we have a lot of data on both of these. So we have studies, a lot of studies at this point, showing that bilingual children do better on executive control tasks when they're 4 years old, 6 years old, 8 years old, and so on. They master these tasks a little earlier, they perform better. Now we also know that socioeconomic status is very strongly related in the opposite direction. The lower the socioeconomic status, the poorer children do on executive function tasks. And similarly, all children differ in their natural ability to control attention, their natural level, if you like, of executive function. And obviously, for children whose brains are just more carefully wired and have better attention, they too will do better on executive function tasks. So I want to look at each of these separately in terms of bilingualism. There's now several studies comparing the effect of bilingualism and the effect of socioeconomic status on the development of executive function. And these studies all show that both factors are additive. So at every level of socioeconomic status, being bilingual is helpful. So even if you're in a low socioeconomic level, bilingual children are doing better than monolingual children. But I'll just tell you about one recent study because it's very dramatic. It was conducted by referring to a database of what's now called big data, which is a real trend in the social sciences. So the researchers had access to scores, if you like, of over 18,000 children in the US. 18,000 children, no single study that we conduct can compete with that. And these children covered a range of socioeconomic levels, covering the whole scale. And the children were monolingual or bilingual, and they all performed some executive function tasks. So here's the really important finding. Bilingual kids always did better than monolingual kids at every socioeconomic level, and the differences were large. But crucially, the differences were greater, which is to say, the boost from bilingualism was substantially greater at the lowest levels of SES. These are the kids who needed it most. So the more the kids were compromised by their low socioeconomic level, the more helpful it was for them to be bilingual. So that's socioeconomic level. We also did a study with children where we looked at their level of normal attentional control and their level of bilingualism. And again, we found that both were helpful. If they had just had better brains wired for attention, they did better on these tasks. And if they were more bilingual, they did better on these tasks. So both made their performance better. But there's a very important caveat here. Children whose natural level of attentional control is problematic may cross a clinical threshold into a condition that could be diagnosed as ADHD or some clinical attention disorder. Those disorders are associated with particular wiring in the brain and wiring precisely in the executive control system. So they're not ADHD because they don't want to pay attention, because they don't want to learn. They have these challenges because of the way their brains are wired and they can't pay attention. In those cases, bilingualism flips from being helpful to being potentially harmful. So there's a few studies with adults who are bilingual or monolingual and have been diagnosed with ADHD. And the bilingual adults with ADHD struggle more than the monolingual adults. And the reason is because the very system that's supposed to be giving them the benefit, because it's kind of trained from being bilingual, is compromised. So we have to be very careful educationally, because when kids struggle in bilingual education programs, the first reaction from the school is to put them in a single language program. And that's usually the wrong solution. But it may not be the wrong solution in this case. So you need to know precisely what they're dealing with. If they're dealing with some learning disability, like dyslexia, or some common learning disability, putting them from a bilingual environment into a monolingual environment will change nothing and you're removing the language. So that's not helpful. But if their problem is an actual diagnosable attention disorder that can be confirmed, then I think a more careful decision needs to be made.
And then I think there's still a lot of confusion in this country, in particular with the bilingual education being transitioned. It's helping, particularly immigrant children, learn English, gain access to the equal opportunities that learning English in the United States provides. But from their language, their, say, monolingual French, monolingual Chinese, to becoming monolingual English speakers. What's your...
Right, and so these programs, so that's right. And when you talk about bilingual education, this is a really important factor. What are the two languages? What's their status in the community, and which one is the majority language? And to be even more blunt, which one's the prestige language? So if the two languages in the bilingual education program, let me start that again. If the primary purpose of the bilingual education program is to teach kids the majority language of the community, English, kids who aren't speaking English at home come to the program just to learn English, that's a very different situation from a program where people do speak English at home. The majority language of the community is the language of the home, and they come to school and they get French. So they learn French. So it's a different relationship between the languages in the community and language of the home, and they all have a kind of a different flavor for how the bilingual education program plays out.
How about Canada? Could you give us some perspective with the common programs in Canada?
The most popular program in Canada is the public education program for French immersion. There's other immersion programs in Canada. In Alberta, there's Mandarin immersion. There's various variations on immersion education. But in Canada, French immersion is the most popular. It's a way to teach children two official languages. So in these programs, typically kids from Anglophone homes go to school and instruction is in French. So their English is never at risk because they speak it at home and it's the language of community. So they're adding on another language. This is primarily the situation in Canada where bilingual education is adding on something to the majority language. That's not always the situation here, where part of the purpose is to educate children in the majority language that they would not otherwise have exposure to.
Although some states do come up with a new definition, particularly with dual language education, and states like Utah, for instance, are changing the way bilingual education is shaped in this country. And I hope it's a model that keeps on changing the scenery. I was going to ask you a silly question, because I'm thinking, I always think of Canada as being a bilingual nation, for instance. And does it mean that Canadians have better brains than
Absolutely.
more Americans? Or more French?
Alright, so you've got to make a distinction between official bilingualism and bilingual individuals. So bilingualism in society means there's two official languages. In Canada, and everybody could say, well, of course, in Canada, there's English and French. That's just a national policy that services, government services and education have to be provided in English and French. Something like 12% of Canadians can speak both English and French. That's all. You look at other countries that have societal bilingualism. Switzerland, there's 4 languages. I bet you can't even name all 4, let alone find a Swiss person who can speak more than one of them fluently. Belgium has official bilingualism. These are not places where the population is bilingual. These are places where you have societal bilingualism in that official services have to be provided.
Okay, so multilingual France has still a chance to perform well internationally. There are many naysayers who say that this is all nonsense, that bilingualism does not play a role, that it's only limited to and specific in the bilingualism of their children. And what kind of questions should they ask themselves? Particularly when there are 2 languages spoken at home, what are the choices that have to be made?
Well, if there's 2 languages spoken at home, it's pretty easy because you have facility with both languages, and so it's really easy. Talk to the kids, read to the kids. Talk to the kids, read to the kids. The more you do those 2 things, the better off. Media is important, but media isn't always available. I don't know if how many different television languages are available in New York City, but if they're not available in New York City, they're not available in Cincinnati, for example, right? So if parents have 2 languages, then it's really pretty easy. Just present those languages. But if it's a different situation, if you have, for example, monolingual parents who send their children to a dual language school or a bilingual school because they want them to learn the other language, which is very commonly the case in Canada. Anglophone parents send their kids to study in French, even if they have little or no French. Then the parent's job is to support English. School will take care of French literacy and French conversation. You do what you can, so you make sure English literacy is at the highest possible level. And there's nothing more important anyway, no matter what you're talking about, than reading stories to kids. Nothing is more important.
Reading. How about singing?
If you can sing, I can't sing. Songs are good, stories are fabulous.
Games as well?
Sure, but stories, you see, stories is interesting because there's so much more information in stories. You're learning a formal narrative structure, you're learning ideas, even if it's a story about a wolf in the woods and all this stuff, there's information that, for a 3 or 4 or 5-year-old mind can be really enticing. I remember when my oldest daughter was really little, her favorite song was Baba Black Sheep. And I thought, oh my God.
What song was it?
Baba Black Sheep. I'm not going to sing it for you.
Oh, yes. I'd love to hear it.
Well, you'll Google it later. And decades later, I mean, she's 41 now, so a long time later, she said, when she used to hear that song, she vividly imagined everything. She imagined the lane, she imagined the sheep. She just had this rich landscape in her mind from this really silly little song. So you multiply that into stories, and what you're doing is feeding kids imaginations, their curiosities, and it's all through language. So you're giving them a lot.
Perhaps we will take a few questions from the audience. I think it's important to hear from the New Yorkers in the room, and of course, there are people from outside of New York. But before we go there, can you tell us how research can help evaluate the outcomes of bilingual education for language, for literacy, for academic achievement?
Okay, let me talk a little bit about that then. So what are the sort of the empirical approaches to bilingual education? I'm going to tell you about one study we did that I found very exciting. It's a very small-scale study. So most of the research we do, especially the research we do in Canada, is quite different from the reality on the ground here. Because the reality in the United States is that bilingual education and bilingualism is largely associated with Spanish-English bilinguals and a lower socioeconomic status. And the bilingual education program, I think, has a slightly different role. So those aren't questions we can easily investigate in Canada. So we did a study a couple of years ago in the Central Valley in California, which is very poor, and it's quite Mexican. It's Hispanic, but mostly Mexican. So we went into a school there, and we tested kids who were about 8 years old, 8, 9 years old. And we did a few things with them. So these kids are all at-risk kids. They're all quite challenged. Their academic outcomes are really not very good. But we gave them not academic tasks, we gave them executive function tasks. And we gave them English and Spanish tests as a way of figuring out how bilingual they were. So, where are their levels of English and Spanish? And the more equivalent they are, the more bilingual they are, and so forth. And it's a small-scale study, but what we were able to show was that the more bilingual the kids were, the better their outcomes on these executive function tasks. All else aside. So just being more bilingual, just building up better language skills in the simplest way, more vocabulary, better conversational ability, was helping them with something that's foundational for academic outcomes, even though at that point they're still struggling. So one educational outcome we need to look at is the relationship between the degree and type of bilingualism and what's happening to kids. And this is something that can be applied broadly. Another thing that we're currently looking at is we're working in French immersion schools in Toronto. These are wildly popular programs. We just tested about 250 kids who are just finishing first grade. And we've given them our standard executive function tasks, but we've also given them language tasks in English and French. And this time what we're interested in is not, well, we will look at how bilingual they are, how good their English and French is. But in this study, we're really interested in their diverse backgrounds, because many of these children, almost half of these children now, come to these French immersion programs from homes where they speak neither English nor French. And they come to school and they're learning French as a third language. And some of these homes are middle class socioeconomically, and some of them are lower. None of them are really at risk. They're not really poor, like the Mexican kids in California, but they're not as high. So we're looking at how these background measures and what other languages they know are influencing their outcomes. So we don't have a lot of information yet. We're going to follow these kids for 3 years. But so far it's looking really exciting. It's looking like the kids who already know another language from home are doing a little better, even on language tasks. So it's easier for them. They come to school and they sort of get language. It's not scary, it's not off-putting. But we'll continue to study that for another few years.
Thank you very much. Professor Bialystok. So we will take a few questions. We have mics in the room, so please go ahead. We have a hand up.
And a lot of the families that we work with working with are very low socioeconomic status families who do not speak English at all. And we offer family literacy workshops to talk to them about bringing literacy home to their children and easy ways to make this happen. But one of the biggest things that we see is that parents who mostly speak Spanish do not want their children speaking Spanish at all. And this is a personal experience of my own growing up in a Colombian American household where my parents refused to teach my brother and I Spanish. And no matter how many times I say, no, this is better for you, or your children will have all these advantages, there's still pushback. So I was wondering if you had any advice on how to talk to these families and encourage them to speak Spanish.
Yeah, it's a great question. You're absolutely right. And you hear this from lots of immigrant groups. I mean, immigrant groups come and say, and have for the last 100 years, we're in America now, we're not going to speak that language, that old world language. You have to become American, just learn English. So this is a huge problem. You're absolutely right. And I have no advice to give you. And you could try explaining to them everything I've been telling you about, but really that's a challenge that you need to deal with, and you're right. You've got to persuade them that it's better for everybody. Here's another reason it's better. The kids need to connect to their families. They need to be able to speak to their grandparents. They need to someday visit the places from which their family emigrated and feel they belong. So aside from their brains, aside from their executive functions, these kids need those languages to complete their own identity and to connect with their families. So good luck with that. I have no special magic solutions.
I have two questions, if I may. One is, you said that executive function in children were bilingual is better than if they were not bilingual. Is the brain, for the second language, is the brain, is it a different part of the brain where you learn, where the second language is sort of learned?
Well, okay, a couple of things here. So let me clarify. So the executive function, it's not that it's better, but it develops at a slightly faster pace. So if you compare, for example, 2 4-year-olds, and we know on average the level of executive control we expect from a 4-year-old, a bilingual kid will be a little ahead of the curve. But all kids get there. I mean, they all develop reasonable executive functions. So it's not that it's an outcome that only bilingual kids achieve. They, through development, are a little ahead of the curve. In terms of where languages are learned, that's a more complicated question. We used to think of brains as kind of phrenology. You know, there's this bit and you can write in language, there's that bit you can write in vision, there's this bit you write in motor control. And that's largely been abandoned. There are regions of specialization, but mostly all of your brain is involved in everything you do. So the language use is a whole brain activity. Where exactly is your knowledge of language stored? Well, someplace in the medial temporal cortex. Maybe some of it overlaps for the 2 languages, maybe some of it doesn't. That is one thing that seems to change with age of acquisition. You know, the closer in age you learn both languages, the more similar the geography. But the geography doesn't matter. And what we understand more about brains now is that it's not the real estate, it's the processors. It's the networks that connect regions of the brain to each other in ongoing activity. So maybe it doesn't sound like an exact answer, but the situation is more complex than same or different areas.
I have 3 questions if you don't mind. Number 1, I deal with students. Some of them are very hyperactive. I am a very hyperactive teacher, so I never repeat a class. So when I see hyperactive students, what I do is I give them the tasks so they can help the friends. And then I obtain 2 things. The hyperactive child comes down and feels important because he's working. Do you think that by doing this, he processes or retains better than on his natural habitat if I were to ignore him and just pretend that he cannot assimilate?
Well, I can't really comment on individual kids. And when you say hyperactive, that covers a lot of territory. So there's sort of normal levels of hyperactivity, which are, you know, just part of a kid's temperament. But there's also clinical levels of hyperactivity, and they're quite different. So I can't really comment on how one of your interventions would affect a kid, because it depends very much on the nature of that hyperactivity.
Okay, the other question I have, yesterday you mentioned that Alzheimer's is somewhat reduced by the capacity of being bilingual. When you say bilingual, are you referring to formal education in the classroom or in general?
Okay, 2 things. First of all, Alzheimer's isn't reduced. What happens is that the normal level of symptomology that accompanies a specific level of Alzheimer's changes, so that a bilingual with early Alzheimer's pathology may not show any symptoms. So they'll continue to function as though there's no dementia, even though their brain has Alzheimer's. So it's not that the Alzheimer's is reduced, but rather that the symptoms are delayed. So by the time symptoms appear in bilinguals, the Alzheimer's is actually more advanced. It's already a more serious disease at that point. It's a slightly different configuration. I'm sorry, what was your second?
Are the subjects being studied?
Oh, right. Does it matter if you become bilingual through formal education, or matters not at all? Matters not at all. And there's this large, I mentioned, I think yesterday, the study in India, where monolingual or bilingual Alzheimer's patients who are completely uneducated, they're completely just conversationally natural learners of another language, because there's so many languages in India, show exactly the same delay in symptoms of Alzheimer's, and they were uneducated entirely.
Okay. My last question, I'm sorry about that. I know a child who is extremely autistic, and his average of understanding the real world is very slow, minimum. But he can understand American Sign Language through his sister. Is there any advantage of him being bilingual, because now he knows sign language and English?
Again, autism spectrum is extremely complex and includes a very wide range of deficits and symptoms. There's one study I'm aware of, it was published recently, that showed bilingual kids with autism spectrum disorder, but very unclear where on the spectrum these kids were. We're doing a little better than monolingual kids. But a lot of autism includes severe language disabilities to the point of kids being nonverbal. So it's difficult to really make any predictions, because autism in itself is so variable. Just as another note though, there are studies of people who are what's called bimodal bilinguals, in that they know both a spoken and a sign language. And those outcomes are similar but not identical to the outcomes we find for speech bilinguals.
Two more questions
Hello, it's a great honor to have you here today, because I read a lot of your work. I'm an English teacher from Russia. I'm a Fulbright program doing a research of young and adult bilinguals. My question, I think, relates to the previous one. Do you think there is any way that a child's personality can help them or prevent them from succeeding in becoming bilinguals? And second point, do you think there is a way that are there any problems that children might face trying to install their identity? Because I think when we speak between languages, our personality might change. So are there potentially any problems that children might face being exposed to languages? Okay.
So I think both of your questions are dealing with the process of learning another language, which is a little outside of what I study. My starting point is you already have these languages, rather than now, although 40 years ago I did look at the process, I don't anymore. But I have to say that I think your assumption is correct. Of course, individual differences in personality determine this, but also everybody is different on every skill we learn. Everybody has a different natural ability to do math, to do sports, to learn to play the piano, and to learn languages. We're all different in our natural ability to achieve all these things. Part of that includes personality differences, interest differences, opportunity differences, but yes, I think these are vastly different on an individual basis. My research starts at the point where I say, all right, whatever you did, however easy or hard it was. Now let's see what the consequence is.
Hi. I have 3 kids, and there are 3 languages going on in the house. I speak Italian to them, my husband is French. French, he speaks French to them, and then they speak the community language in English. So Italian is the third one, and English dominates right now. And it's fascinating to see how the three kids perceive the languages, how they react and how they use it. My question is, I'm trying to stick to the idea of me speaking Italian all the time, although especially one of the three responds in English. So sometimes I'm concerned that am I pushing too much, am I stressing them too much, where do I draw the line, am I doing the right thing or not?
So my best source of information about trilingual families with little kids is anecdotal. So let me tell you what I extract from the anecdotes, and you may recognize some of this. Point one, oh my God, there aren't enough hours in the day. Now, I finally got them all tucked into bed and I didn't get enough Italian time, right? So when you think about how many hours a day kids actually are online, which is to say, awake, engaged, ready or willing to talk to you, and then you have to divide that time not across 2 languages but 3 languages. Some language is going to get shortchanged. In your case, it's Italian. Point 2, there is a pecking order, and I will guess that your youngest child is far less fluent in Italian than the oldest child, right?
The first one and the second one have the strongest.
Exactly, it decreases. And it decreases for 2 reasons. One is because the kids start speaking to each other in the community language, and quite honestly, parents give up. So you see with each child the third language depleting. And it's not a terrible thing, it's a matter of time, and it's a matter of accepting the influence of peers, friends, the community on this. And the final question I have to trilingual families, especially ones who try to maintain a real person language strategy. What do you do at the dinner table? It becomes rather complicated. So since my main conjecture about language in families is that it's for communication, I think, just don't be so rigid, just make sure people are talking to each other, and that's more important.
Hi, so I'm a speech therapist, so I work with bilingual children who have learning disorders, such as dyslexia. And you said that going from bilingual education to monolingual education will help them?
Won't hurt them.
Won't hurt them. Because I have a lot of parents who are concerned with that and they want to go back to monolingual education, so how can I reassure them?
This is a huge problem in the various arms of the professional community, education, SLPs for sure, physicians, lots of people who work with families around issues of learning disabilities, just have a terrible time getting over this notion that simplifying the language environment will help the kid. And there is simply no evidence except for a couple of specific cases that I mentioned, like a real attention problem. That might be an exception. So as a very good scholar in this area, Catherine Conner, says in her book, if you take a bilingual child with a learning disability and you remove one of the languages, you have a monolingual child with a learning disability. That's a disadvantage, right? So even, you're not going to cure dyslexia by putting the child in a monolingual environment. You're just taking something away that isn't particularly harmful. And there are a very small number of studies that have been done properly. It's really hard to do this research properly. But there are a small number of studies looking at specific language impairment, dyslexia, dyslexia, learning abilities of this type, where you do the proper comparison, which is bilingual children or children in a bilingual environment, or a bilingual education program, and children with exactly the same disability profile in a monolingual program. And now you can ask, is the child in the bilingual program doing any worse than the child in the monolingual program? And the answer is no. The problem is most of the research just looks in the bilingual education classroom and said, these kids with learning disabilities are doing worse in that classroom than the kids without learning disabilities. Of course they are. They have a learning disability. But that's the wrong comparison. So in the handful of studies that do the correct comparison, there is no difference. But again, I'd say there are cases that need special attention, like clinical ADHD.
So we'll take 2 more questions. Okay.
Hi. I really appreciate the dialogue that was had about a purist classroom with one side being one language, one side being the other, because I think the energy, at least right now, in the system that I work in, which I will not name out loud, is that it should be either split or 2 separate rooms. And when we were first approached with that, I didn't think it made sense, or I just wanted some research to show that kids do better when the room is split and you can only speak this language. And we felt that it would either result in silence or it just doesn't make sense. And when I asked for research, not because I was being disrespectful, there is none, at least from an academic or a psychological background. And so my question is there research on that, or is it just common sense? And the second thing is, what are your feelings about the teacher code switching to support students? I get what you're saying about children needing to express themselves and creating a culture around that. What are your feelings about, from your background, about the teachers switching languages?
Okay, the first answer is easy. You're right, there's no research. It's observation and it's common sense. Should teachers be allowed to code switch? Well, code switch has this terrible derogatory aura about it, like you're really crossing some Rubicon if you switch languages. But why? Where does that come from? Again, like in a family, I think the teacher's main job is to communicate. And I have high regard for teachers. I think teachers are doing a terribly difficult job. And I trust the intuitions of good teachers. And if good teachers feel that they can get through to this kid in some way, and that way may involve including bits of another language, why wouldn't you? So I just don't see code switching as inherently a terrible thing. What's important is communicating, and you do what's necessary to achieve it.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Bialystok, for coming on that. Have a very good day in rainy New York, and let's create more bilingual programs in the city. Thank you.